Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we have an extremely rare, complete, and matching Argentine model of 1909 sniper to take a look at. Now, this is the second of the major patterns of Mauser bolt-action rifle that Argentina bought. The first one was, of course, the model 1891. They were one of the first countries to adopt the Mauser, and they bought single-stack, very early 1891s. At that point, they were interested in precision rifles, but didn't actually do anything about it. They came back to Mauser in 1909. They signed the contract for improved, newer models like this. And then in 1913, they procured 500 telescopic sights to mount on their 1909 rifles. There are a couple interesting things about this. So first off, they don't appear to have ever mounted these scopes on full-length infantry rifles. As far as we can tell, they were all mounted on cavalry carbines, which I think makes sense. The extra barrel length isn't really all that important. It's going to change the ballistic curve, the trajectory a little bit, but if you've got the scope set up for that trajectory, it doesn't make any difference. And it makes the rifles handier. It's going to make the rifles easier for snipers to move in and out of positions with. I think it makes a lot of sense, which is partly why it's rather odd that, to me, that sort of sensible decision isn't very common with sniper rifles, military sniper rifles, around this time period. So we have a side-mounted 3-power scope. These were purchased from France, and there's some interesting developmental history there as well. The company they purchased them from was called SOM, Société Optique et Mécanique, so company of optical mechanical company, which was a joint venture between a photography company, a guy who had built a photography company, and the Schneider company, which of course specialized in arms, mostly heavy arms. Schneider would go on to, for example, build tanks, among other things, during the First World War. Well, Argentina had dealings with the Schneider company previously, and so it's that connection that probably led them to use SOM as their contractor for scopes. So they buy 500 of the scopes, and they come up with a really clever mount, which is either developed in France and used on these, or developed in Argentina, and then copied by the French a few years later. Let's take a look at that up close. So the way this works is we have a big knurled knob on the side of the scope mount there. And to remove the scope, we're going to turn this forward. You actually lift it out a bit at the same time. I'm going to pull this out, rotate it forward like that, and then the scope just comes right off. So the way this works is we have a plunger, a big plunger, right there, and it is tapered to ensure a precise fit. And then there's a hole, a matching hole, on the scope base right here. We also have a bit of dovetail rail on these two surfaces that are going to slide over that rail and that rail. So to put this back on, we're gonna lock the knob out, and that just slides on right there. And I rotate it 90 degrees, and now it is very thoroughly locked in place. So it's a clever, simple, and effective scope mount. And it's the scope mount that the French would decide to adopt just a couple of years later. This is the last of the French World War I pattern scope mounts. They went through a couple of really subpar systems first, and then they came to this one, which, as you can see there, is the exact same system. We just have that locking plunger. The only thing the French did differently was they put 2 separate mounts on the scope instead of one large monolithic one like the Argentines did. But lock that out, and the thing just slides on like that. This particular one is really tight, so I'm not going to try and force it on there. But interesting that that this connection came up, because the Argentine scope predates the French World War II ones. These were purchased in 1913 and assembled onto the rifles about the same time. This dates to, well, it's an APX 1916 scope, 1916-1917 period for the French. Now, if we take a look at some of the markings on the scope mount, right here, we have the rifle serial number stamped into the outside of the base. So this is A6896. If we take the scope off, you can see on the top of the mount here, we have 6896 as well. And that is the serial number of the rifle. Now, there's nothing that would intrinsically prevent this from being mounted on a full-length infantry rifle, but all of the known examples have A prefix numbers. The infantry rifles went from like A through M. There were an awful lot of them. The cavalry carbines only had A through just barely into the C series. So A covers a lot higher proportion of the cavalry carbines, and all of the known examples of rifles that actually have these originally mounted are cavalry carbines. Now, there is the reference book, the classic reference book on Argentine Mausers, describes these as originally being mounted on model 1891 rifles. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure that that is a mistake on the part of the author, because this mount has a step in it right there, and it actually doesn't fit. It can't fit on a small ring Mauser like in 1891. It'll fit perfectly on these. As you can see here, the step fits right into that difference between the ring and the side of the receiver. One of the other cool elements about this mount is it actually clears the stock without any modification. So the receiver has to be drilled and tapped for it with these 4 screw holes, but there isn't any modification to the receiver that's needed, which is nice. I think a lot of people designing scope mounts just didn't even think about having to modify stocks and were happy to require it. This system would actually fit any large ring Mauser. You could put one of these on a K98K in theory, but that's because it's the same receiver geometry as the Argentine 1909. It is worth pointing out that the bolt handles on these rifles are bent, but that's because that was the standard practice on the cavalry carbines. They all had bent bolt handles. If these were put on infantry rifles, they would not have bothered to bend the bolt handle because the scope is offset to the left, so you don't have to change the bolt to clear the scope for loading stripper clips, and that's the reason that they always bent the bolt handles on sniper rifles. If we look at the scope a bit more closely, first off, we will see that it is extremely similar to the French APX scopes. Same overall length, basically the same sort of geometry, which makes sense. French scope probably involved in the design with APX. Anyway, we have, starting at the back of the scope, we have a little screw right here and right there, and those are the mounting points, the locking points for a rubber eye cup. Unfortunately, the eye cup that we have here with this rifle is not in good shape and the rubber's quite hard, but this would go on like that and then rotate to lock into place. We then have the SOM manufacturer's mark, the scope serial number, 245 in this case, and those will run from 1 to 500. 3X, it's a 3-power magnification scope. RA is for República Argentina, because that's just their standard military acceptance or property marking. There is adjustable focus on the scope, located around the body there. We have a bullet drop compensator here that has actually really nice, discernible, tangible clicks, which is a little bit unusual for this period. It goes out to 1,000 meters in 50-meter increments. Also a bit unusual to have that granular of an adjustment for this period. The reticle on that SOM 3-power scope is just a simple German post. This one's got a lot of flex in there. It's clearly seen a lot of use over time in Argentina. Worth also pointing out that as I adjust the BDC, that reticle moves in the scope view. Now, what we don't have is any way to adjust windage or elevation on the scope. This is going to be set by the factory in the mounts, in the base. The mounts are integral to the base, and once it's put together, it's not getting adjusted. So how do you actually zero it? Well, on the base are two slightly lifted surfaces, and you would grind on these to get them down to the correct height to properly zero the scope. It is possible, maybe, since this front lens is a little bit eccentric, you might be able to tweak a little bit of windage by rotating this, but the intention is these are all zeroed at the factory. That's why they're numbered to their individual rifles, and it's these raised surfaces that you use for that zeroing. Scope cases were made for these, again, typical of the period. If you're not using the scope, the whole reason that it's easily detachable is so you can take it off the rifle and carry it in a protective case so that it doesn't get damaged. These cases have a belt loop back there. These were made in Argentina, and they're numbered to the scope number. So this is actually the correct case for scope number 245 here. And the scope would go into the case this direction with that mounting block sitting in that extended area. And then in theory, it's going to rest on this, and the rubber eye cap isn't going to be crushed in the bottom of the case there. There's the inside. It's just going to slide right in. And lock in place. This little block to hold the scope properly in place in there. Ultimately, these rifles would serve not all that long with Argentina. Of course, they didn't see any real combat service because Argentina wasn't in the First World War. In 1927, Argentina replaced these with 4-power scopes made by Zeiss, and that's a subject for another whole video. But these are really quite scarce to find anywhere outside of Argentina, especially having a complete matched pair with the rifle and the scope is really cool. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.